for fighting auto insurance fraud. Those cuts would take place on July 1st, and every DA program in the state would cut its budget, its program at that point. So we're asking that the money be restored to the local district attorneys to prosecute these cases. We're asking that, in essence, the governor's last year veto be set aside and the money be reinstituted. I think that your staff has done a wonderful job in giving you the background. The one area that we are not in agreement with is the issue of reserving 1/3 of the money for future contingencies. There is no mechanism to distribute this money absent the authority to disperse it in the state budget. So it's hard for us to understand what we're protecting against by saving the money now. If it's not in the budget, it can't be dispersed this year. And to use the colloquialism, the wolf is at the door for us now, not sometime in the future. Every participant in the program understands that in future years, if the revenue goes down, there's less money to disperse, and therefore the grants would be have less money in, say, 11, 12. The problem now is in 10, 11, and it doesn't make sense for us to keep 1/3 of the money back as a reserve to protect we don't know what.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, members, my name is Dan Filizzato. I'm Deputy District Attorney with the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. The idea of the reserves, prudent reserves are an excellent idea when you're talking about state agencies and state programs, because it sits there and it protects when the legislature approves the budget. It sits there and funds a certain number of personnel years and programs, and having a prudent reserve for a state program makes sense, because if revenues come in below expectations, you can use that reserve to make sure that you don't have to lay off employees mid-year or eliminate programs mid-year. However, on a local assistance item, we don't believe that the reserve makes sense, because the grants that are given by DOI already contain a clause that say if revenues come in below expectations, your grant will be cut by the appropriate percentage. So keeping that reserve, like I say, we don't get funded if, let's say, revenues are down 10%. So your grant is cut 10%. DOI doesn't take that money and then distribute that, to the DAs to make up that 10%. It would just sit there. The local assistance items, like I say, we have cases today that we can't begin investigations on because we don't have the resources. In our county, because of the reductions in funding, our unit has lost 1 full-time prosecutor, 2 full-time investigators, and a staff person to assist on this. Given the state of, not only the state's budgets, but the county budgets, we are not in a position to be able to go to our Board of Supervisors and ask, would you please provide us extra funding to backfill these positions? The county has, we're closing clinics and hospitals and programs. We simply can't do that for a program like auto fraud. In the meantime, there is money sitting in an account that could fund those positions, could fund those programs. Like my colleague said, when AB 1050, the urban auto grant bill, was run by Senator Wright and then the Assemblyman, there was no expectation that money was going to be held back. It was that money is collected. It can only be used for auto fraud programs, percentage to DOI, percentage to CHP, percentage to your local DAs. There was never contemplation of not expending all the money that was collected. Like I say, there are serious cases out there that, like I say, right now we just unfortunately do not have the resources to investigate. And since this reserve wouldn't be protecting, your local DA positions and programs, we don't think that it's prudent to keep that reserve for the local DAs. If you want to keep a reserve for the CHP and DOI, I would understand that, because that is the budget. That's the state's budget. our county budgets are not protected by this reserve, so we would request that the full allocation be spent.
Understood. I think staff's attempt, at least my understanding in our conversations, is to give you as much as the word prudent comes to mind here. And as a former county supervisor who believed in prudent reserves but then understood in circumstances like this you've got crimes being committed and services need to be funded and implemented, it's always a battle. And then there's the hope that hopefully we're through the worst of times and it'll start getting better. However, I think what we're trying to do, and I think you recognize, is go further than Solomon in the sense of giving you more money than the governor would like to, but still keep a little there, and might also preclude having other discussions with the administrations of you not getting the amount we're trying to. So we're trying to negotiate a thin line to get you as much as politically prudent, I think, is what we're trying to do. And absent you coming in, being able to tell me or our staff that you've had some discussions with the administration that they would hold you harmless if we gave you all that money, I think we're being prudent in your behest, sort of the way I look at it.
The only issue that I know for our office is simply collecting or setting up a reserve, but without a mechanism to distribute it. That's where we're concerned. Is like, say, we have, let's say, about $3 million or $4 million this year. Next year it's 6 to 8, and it keeps growing. And in the meantime, positions are lost.
Understood.
That aren't going to be backfilled.
And I hope you understand we're trying to do a political. The committee is sympathetic, is what I'm trying to say, but be careful what you ask for, because you might not get what we're trying to give you.
No, and I understand.
Is the point.
I understand that.
Okay.
Yeah, we were just wondering if the committee wants to set up a reserve, or with the department, if they would also include some language that, for example, when revenues come in below expectation, that there's some mechanism to expend from the reserve to make up that difference. Then we would be supportive of that type of program.
I'll be happy to have some kind of off discussion with you before this goes to the full budget committee.
Sure.
We don't want to put, I know the chairman wants as little work at that level as possible, so, but personally I'd be happy to have a good discussion with that.
Thank you. I think the other concern is, it doesn't have to be a full third.
Right.
Could it be 20%? Could it be 10%? Something smaller?
And of course my point is, we're not negotiating this in a vacuum. There's someone else who has an opinion about this.
Perfectly will understand that.
So, Senator Reddy-McLeod, welcome. We had a whole discussion about when you're going to arrive, and then you walked in the door as soon as we changed the calendar around. Okay, well, the staff recommendation is, as stated, that keep the equivalent of a little over $2 million reserve and a little over $1 million reserve. My recommendation is that we would agree to that, but then we would have the discussion before it goes to full budget.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, Will Shapps from the Department of Finance. Finance would just like to note that we feel the expenditure levels proposed in the governor's budget are appropriate.
Thank you. Understood. What he said? Okay. All right. We'll move on then. And actually, I'm sorry. Yeah, we're voting on that. Staff recommendation is, as I stated, are you okay with that, Senator? All right. So it's 2-0. With the proviso.
Thank you very much.
Continue to discuss. So we're going to move back to the vote-only items on the. Okay. So we're going to go to the first item, issue number 1 through 4 on the Department of Insurance. They are paperless workflow system project, the telecommunications infrastructure replacement project, mortgage guarantee insurers, and life settlements. Again, this is vote only. Senator Reddy-McLeod, are you okay with these? All right, as am I. So the record will show that those are 2-0. Then, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, we will go to ARA funds oversight. Okay. It's a very organic calendar. Sorry, Herb, don't move. We're going to go to the Secretary of State's office. But nobody has to move because it's vote only unless the committee has any questions. So again, these are vote only items on the Secretary of State's issues. Issue number 1, Help America Vote Act spending plan. 2, Help America Vote Act Vote Cal. Issue 3 is county reimbursement for May 19, 2009 special election. And issue number 4, funding for additional measure on the November statewide general election ballot, the provisional language. Senator Negretti McLeod, the...
On issue 4, specifically mentioned that there's provisional language.
All right. The provisional language, understood. So just to clarify, there is provisional conditional language on issue number 4, and the recommendation is to approve it with that language, correct? All right. So this is vote only. Are you okay with these items, Senator? All right. That will then the record will show that it's 2-0 on those items. Now, before the American Recovery and Investment Act goes away, we'll have you come up. So we're going to ARA.
So you've got to be moving all over the place?
We've been trying to anticipate your schedule as well as others. So we've done the vote-only items. We've gone to ARA. We will go to ARA now, and then we'll go back up to the Office of Planning and Research and just go through the agenda as originally scheduled. So we've got ARA, Office of Planning and Research, the California Agency on Service and Volunteering. We're done with the Secretary of State, the Citizens Redistricting Initiative, and then we will be adjourned. No, that'll be the last thing we do. All right. LAO?
Jason Cisney, Legislative Analyst's Office. In February 2009, as you know, Congress passed and the President signed the federal stimulus legislation, ARA. And over the next several months, it became apparent that the state's responsibilities for auditing and reporting and transparency and oversight were obviously rather substantial. The governor, during the first few months, began his administration to work on these issues. The governor created on his own the Office of Inspector General related to the Recovery Act. And then when the budget passed last July, the legislature set forward a fairly clear policy about the state's funding of these oversight activities. The key principle is that they were to be funded from available federal resources that were to be provided for these activities, and that they were to be focused on the required activities, principally with the existing agencies that had been approved and created by the legislature. The Bureau of State Audits in the lead as the state's primary auditing entity, as well as the Recovery Act Task Force created by the governor, the state's existing Office of State Audits and Evaluation, and the legislature also allowed the administration to have a very small budget for the governor's inspector general with a, quote, very limited number of staff. There, as it turns out, will only be about $14 million from the federal government for these activities. I think many people think that's much less than is needed. It's much less than was promised by the federal government earlier. But the legislature's directives in last year's budget acts, as well as the Joint Legislative Budget Committee's direction, has been to try to stick to the policy, federal funds only, not hit the state's general fund. And that would mean spending about $7 million in the current year and $7 million in the budget year. The governor's proposals would result in the general fund actually having to pay perhaps over $2 million, which is inconsistent with the legislature's previous policy. So in our recommendation, we tried to stick to the legislature's policy, focus oversight activities as much as possible to where they are required by federal law with existing entities, make sure that the Bureau of State Audits, the lead auditing agency for the state, has the resources that it needs, and it would produce the amounts that are discussed in the staff recommendation. These are our thoughts, and obviously this is a very challenging issue, and if you have any questions, be happy to answer them.
Okay. Finance, anything right now?
Kristen Shelton, Department of Finance. I would just like to note that the administration's proposal provides a very balanced approach to the oversight of Recovery Act funds, and that while there is some small amount of general fund that will likely need to be spent on these oversight activities, there has also been very broad benefits to the general fund as a result of the Recovery Act or the stimulus funds. resulting in more than $8 billion in direct federal relief to programs that were previously funded by the general fund. The other thing to note is that in doing oversight, which is extremely critical, we're protecting those federal funds. Federal agencies have basically been given the authority on a case-by-case basis to terminate, suspend, or disqualify existing and future federal funds for failure to comply with the Recovery Act reporting and transparency requirements. Significant reductions increase the likelihood of fraud, waste, and abuse of those public funds. And if we don't meet the federal mandates for accountability, we could be ineligible for funds that have not yet been awarded and could also incur federal penalties requiring the reimbursement of funds already awarded. With that, the modest expenditure of $2.3 million in general fund resources to support the task force efforts, including that reduction of $100,000, which we had also noted and can support, the Inspector General at $3.4 million, the Controller as revised by our April 1 finance letter at $1.3 million, and the Bureau of State Audits at $1.2 million, which reflects an increase of $500,000, acknowledging that the proposal and the plan that was initially put before you did not include costs for their second half of the fiscal year. All of these entities collectively have kind of unique responsibilities. They are responsible for overseeing more than 1,000 awards or formula allocations, and there's over 6,000 subrecipients out there that would likely require monitoring it on some level.
Thank you. We're going to go to the auditor, and then we'll go in to Mr. Schultz, and then the Controller, and then the Inspector General.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. Elaine Howell, California State Auditor. My comments will be brief. This first year of stimulus money coming into California, as I'm sure you're aware, we conduct the single audit on an annual basis. What the single audit is a combination of the audit of the state's financial statements that the Controller issues, and then looking at federal programs to make sure that California properly administers those programs in accordance with federal regulations and different rules. When the Recovery Act was signed by President Obama, clearly there was heightened awareness and additional responsibilities for state audit shops like myself, my office. So we embarked on a plan to identify those programs that were going to be receiving significant increases in federal dollars. They may have been existing programs that we had looked at in the past, or perhaps some programs that we had never looked at because in the past they received small amounts of money. An example is the weatherization program received traditionally very small amount of federal dollars. Under the Recovery Act received over 180, I think it was about $186 million. So we did a combination of things. We completed the single audit for this year, completed it by March 31st, which was required by federal rules. Looked at some existing programs that received stimulus money, but also did some what we called interim reporting at the behest of both the Office of Management and Budget at the federal level and the Government Accountability Office. Also encouraged early reporting and doing some of these early, as we called them, preparedness reviews. We completed all of that work. We have our last preparedness review will be issued in early May on a grant over at CalEMA, so that information will be out in the next few weeks. For the administration. Have had a good working relationship with the task force. Some of these programs we've done some early preparedness, we think will really create some efficiencies as we start to complete the single audit for next year, because as I'm sure you're aware, some of the federal money has been slow to flow out to the local level, but I think these preparedness reviews have assisted the administration in identifying departments that need some assistance in managing these huge influxes of federal money. So long story short, we've completed the single audit. In the budget last year, there was an appropriation of $1.6 million available to us. We spent, I wish it were a billion.
Nice try.
1.4 million. So we came in, we anticipate by the end of this fiscal year, we will have expended $1.4 million in the work I was describing. Our estimate for this next year, as was acknowledged, went from $700,000. We estimated it for the first 6 months when the governor's budget came out, because because we really didn't know how much federal money would be flowing and how many of those programs we would actually have to look at for this next fiscal year, but we have a better handle on that. So we think the $1.2 million is a good estimate, particularly factoring in some of the early preparedness we've done. So we've already done some work this year that will benefit our work that we do on the single audit this next year. So with that, I can answer any questions you might have.
Well, it's sort of a statement on our time that the much respected auditor can slip up a B for M. Controller's Office, do you have comments on any? You're just here to answer questions?
We're here to answer questions, sir.
Mr. Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator. Just very brief remarks. Herb Schultz, Director of the California Recovery Task Force and the Governor's Senior Advisor. As the Department of Finance said, the Governor, in putting forward this, has sort of two components, if you will, to the oversight of the Recovery Act in its broadest sense. One is the area which I direct, which is the California Recovery Task Force. Our responsibility is the oversight and implementation and working with the departments and the agencies. There's more than 30 that have responsibilities, that receive money, that put money in several different programs, dozens of programs across the state. We're also the reporting entity that takes all of that information from the dollars that come directly from the federal government to the state and report all of its uses in terms of the effectiveness and the efficiency of getting the money out on the street to both create jobs, to do job training, to provide safety net services like unemployment insurance, TANF, food stamps, and the like that come in and out. The Governor also appointed the first in the nation Inspector General, and Laura can speak very specifically to the difference in the responsibilities that we have, but I think all of the entities here in my time of doing this, both in terms of the IG, the State Auditor, the State Controller's Office, have all been working in partnership, additionally with the CIO's office, to make sure from all of these levels that the funds are being spent effectively and efficiently. We had an opportunity during the Joint Labor Committee hearing just to talk very briefly about sort of where we are in these programs, and I think the things that have been done on the auditing side, the reviewing side, we started out as a task force doing readiness reviews. Why? Because we wanted to ensure that we understood from a risk perspective which of our departments, which of our agencies were potentially susceptible to not being able to handle some of these things or may need a little bit of extra help. And we've been very pleased that, especially in the state energy program, we're now at 90% of those funds being awarded and much of that out on the street. So those are sort of the things that we've been concentrating on. So all of the different types of reviews and audits that have been done, I think, plus our own, have contributed greatly now to being able to say that we're moving forward on programs that we're having issues, and not that we won't have issues again, but even the state weatherization program, which has had some significant issues as we've taken care of the Energy Commission, we reached a very high percentage of our goal as of March 31, and we have appreciated and continue to appreciate the support of the legislature. It's very much been a partnership with them as well. So I'll let Laura do her piece, but on behalf of the Governor, that's the piece where I sit, but we also have this other piece which the Governor has strongly supported, and we'll turn it over to my colleague.
Since we're giving the administration your considerable talents, could we, I mean, are you the multi-billion-dollar man? They gave money and we gave them.
I could say that I'm looking forward. I've been appointed, as you know, by the President to head HHS Region 9 starting Monday. I end tomorrow and start that. And I am looking forward to working with the legislature, with you, with the Senator, and others from a different vantage point. But a large amount of my responsibility is ensuring that the needs of the state and the local governments and the tribal governments, plus the stakeholders, that I advise Secretary Sebelius of the needs of the state. So you have my commitment that I will be making sure that my new boss and bosses understand what the state needs.
I think that was a clear commitment for billions of dollars of more funding.
Please don't show this tape to the secretary. But it's very bittersweet for me, as I said, because the work of this task force and the work of all of these pieces is vital to the people of California. And the Recovery Act, I'm happy to say there are large pieces of Health and Human Services in that, and I'll continue to be working from that side.
Well, I'm sure I express the opinion of all of my colleagues that we appreciate your public service to the state of California and multiple administrations, and we'll miss you very much, but we know that you'll be nearby in San Francisco.
Okay,
and
absolutely.
As a Bay Area resident, we always find it amusing when people from Los Angeles transition to Sacramento and then San Francisco. So if you have cultural problems, there's therapists I can send you to.
Well, I have to tell you that my partner is in West Hollywood, and we do the commute, and my therapist is there, and I'm going to keep her. So I'll be working up and back between
Actually, going
the two.
from West Hollywood to San Francisco isn't much of a leap. So anywhere else in L.A., it would be.
It's actually not.
Well, we need an inspector general at this point, so welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
I neglected to say one thing. I'm sorry. Rick Rice, who is sitting right here, is the new director of the task force as of tomorrow. We've been transitioning for a couple of weeks. He had previously served as Undersecretary of Labor under Vicki Bradshaw in the administration and head of the Unemployment Insurance Appeals Board. So I just want to make sure that you know you're in great hands.
Great. Welcome. And as you know, you have big shoes to fill. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator. So yesterday I was before the Assembly Budget Subcommittee. I marched in with guns blazing about the status quo and going over point by point some of the LAO recommendations. I'm going to limit my comments today and say that, first of all, the LAO cites a huge increase in my budget from 09-10 to this coming year. This is in fact misleading. The numbers cited by the LAO ignore the fact that 80% of my staff are now borrowed from other departments, and so the budget before you is reflecting not only the true cost of running my office, but a small expansion because next year there's going to be a lot more money out on the streets to be watching. As the state auditor said, some of this money has been slow to get out there. That's been one of my challenges in deciding what to look at, is finding areas where significant money has been spent. Secondly, I'd like to point out that there is not replication of what I'm doing and what the state auditor is doing. As she stated, she is focusing on state departments and their internal controls and their ability to follow federal guidelines and requirements. I am following the money out into neighborhoods and on the street and looking at the subrecipients and how they spend it. I'd also like to make the point that I am before you today on my budget as Recovery Inspector General, and I think there's been some muddling between other discussions that are very separate from me and very separate from my budget as Recovery Inspector General in talk and bills introduced around the issue of a permanent Inspector General. And then lastly, I'd like to say that a modest commitment of general fund money to ensure the appropriate oversight of over $80 billion seems to me to not be a terrible reach. Because OPR is continuing through the end of this fiscal year, I can easily reduce the hit on the general fund in my budget request from between $300,000 to $500,000 by existing within OPR for the first 6 months. So I think on both some of the personal services money that's in my budget and equipment and operating could be absorbed and lessened by about $500,000.
Well, LAO, you have any comments? And then
I think that it's important to note that the legislature did not authorize in the Budget Act or in the JLBC's subsequent action, at least to my knowledge, a significant ongoing or longer term transfer of staff from other departments to the Inspector General. The legislature has provided only really a small amount of money to the Inspector General. And given the other very important oversight work of the Bureau of State Audits, the State Controller's Office, which has an important role with local governments, and the task force, it is just very difficult within the legislature's directive to contain this within federal funds to provide the Inspector General more than the $800,000 that we propose for 1011. On page 25 of your agenda, your staff has the information which shows the rather substantial increase in the Inspector General's budgeted resources that the administration proposes for 1011. Those are the facts. And under our recommendation, the budget for the Inspector General's staff would go from $649,000 to $800,000. The budget for OSE under the Inspector General, under our recommendation, would be eliminated, although OSE would retain resources through the task force. As staff and our office have interacted with the administration in recent months, it's become apparent that OSE, which is an existing state entity, plays a very important role in helping departments prepare for administering Recovery Act dollars, not in a sort of punitive or gotcha way, but in a proactive way of assisting them and trying to help them administer it and to be successful. I think that one of the things to keep in mind is that the legislature in the 2009-10 Budget Act focused Recovery Act oversight resources on existing state entities with the Bureau of State Audits in the lead. That was an explicit decision in legislative discussions last year. It is challenging when the governor creates a new office such as the Inspector General without consulting with the legislature in a formal way through legislation beforehand. The goals of the Inspector General clearly quite worthy, but when the governor sort of puts the cart before the horse and creates offices, it puts the legislature in this very difficult position where you're being told that if you don't approve continuing the activities that the governor has unilaterally put in place, that somehow the legislature would be making a fault with this decision. The executive branch, when it creates a department, an agency, an office in the governor's office for whatever worthy topic, needs to come to the legislature first. And that's the way our system is supposed to work.
That's a very analytical approach to the problem. I appreciate your comments. Senator Negretti-McLeod.
I'm going to ask a question that of all three of you. What happens to the money that isn't spent well out there? Do the counties, the cities, do they get punished? Does somebody say no, no, no? Does it come back to somebody else? So what happens?
Well, there is, and the controller can speak to this as well. Any entity that receives in excess of $500,000 in federal dollars, and that could be a combination of a variety of grants, are required to have a single audit. My office does the single audit on behalf of the state of California, as Laura indicated, at the state level. We're in the state agencies. So if there's a grantee out at the local level that receives, again, greater than $500,000, they have to have a comparable single audit. That audit is submitted to the controller's office, and then the controller, and again, they can speak more eloquently about this than I, but my understanding is those audits come into the controller's office. They look at them to determine if there are issues or concerns, and if there are, they forward that audit to the respective agency. So if there are issues with workforce investment boards or the WIA program, that needs to get to EDD, so EDD can deal with that subrecipient. But again, that's a single audit that's occurring, once a year. It was when they're doing the single audit. As far as any punitive, it would be up to EDD, and then certainly at the federal level, the federal agency would need to make a determination as to whether or not they were going to do anything in the future as far as modifying their grant award or anything like that. I don't know the specifics about what criteria the federal government would use with regard to questionable expenditures. So hopefully that assists.
From the Controller's Office, the State Auditor has pretty much laid out the single audit responsibilities of the Controller. and those are correct. I would point out that those issues that come up through the audit process frequently deal with procedures and policies and internal controls or the lack thereof, as opposed to specific items that are unallowable. To the extent that we find unallowable issues through other audits that we may be doing, or should the federal government find unallowable issues, since most of the money that we're talking about comes through the state, the federal government will see us as the cognizant agency and the most responsible agency, and to the extent that the money has to be returned, the federal government will hold the state accountable. We may have, through our own processes to try and recover from the local government, but the one that's most immediately on the hook is the state.
In terms of the task force's role, and then I'll turn to Laura, the governor, I think, in the legislature have made very clear that in terms of ARA funding, the Recovery Act funding, that no dollar, there should never be a problem that cannot be rectified so that any money that we receive of that $85 billion in cash and tax benefits get returned to the federal government. Now, what does that mean for us? What that means for the task force is when you're dealing with the normal operation and, if you will, the hiccups that we've had with the state weatherization program and some earlier with the state energy program. We roll up our sleeves, we work with the departments that are involved, and we ensure that the program operations are working. If there is ever any evidence in any program from any recipient, and this is a long-standing policy, of fraud, waste, or abuse, it used to be turned, say, if we use Elaine's example, from EDD would go immediately to the Federal Department of Labor. Now when we see that, because of our funds, we turn to the department, will turn to the federal side, and we will turn to the Inspector General and say, within a 24-hour period, we've got an issue here. This is what we believe is happening. But from the general programmatic side, we as a task force work to ensure that the problems that are identified and how these programs are running are rectified so that no money will be sent back to the federal government because of any mismanagement or misspending within that state operation.
I believe, Senator, your question was what happens if we find problems. I mean, there absolutely is a risk of dollars having to be returned, and I concur completely with what Mr. Schultz just said. It is, in fact, why the governor created the IG position and hired me for that work. It was his intense desire not to see a single dollar returned. And it's very much why I'm out looking at subrecipients. So in the last 3.5 months, when I received 6 borrowed auditors, we have done 9 reviews. We've got 10 more underway. We have already found about $5 million of recovery dollars that were misdirected. The whole point of my office, actually, is to prevent problems. It's why I'm out there as quickly and as vigorously as I am, because the mistakes we're finding are correctable. What I have seen in these subrecipient shops is, as my auditors are in there uncovering problems, they're running as quickly as they can behind us to correct them. So they don't have to return money. The state's not going to have to return money. I would like to, I can't help myself, I have to also comment on the gotcha approach. I've often been criticized in my past life for blasting things out through the media. My whole purpose in doing that is because what I see over and over again, exemplified by repeat findings in single audit, is that unless there's pressure for change, the status quo stays in place. And my whole point in working with the media to get the word out is to share lessons learned, so that if I find a problem in one work investment board, for example, the 49 other work investment boards up and down the state will not make that same mistake. Or if I find something in a work investment board that the EDD needs to take care of with all of their work investment boards, as they did after my first report on a Central Valley work investment board. They sent out new direction to all of their WIBs. So anyway.
The reason I ask is because, how long have you been here, Senator DeSaulnier?
About an hour and a half.
No. As a legislator, how long have you been
I
here?
prefer not to think about it. It goes back to the therapy thing.
Oh, by the way, I used to be a
over 30 years.
psychotherapist, so I'll volunteer my...
Well, that's
I have enough therapists.
my recommendation is to cut your budget completely.
The reason I ask this, Senator DeSaulnier has been here 3 years. I have been here, this is my 10th year. And up to now, when there's been lots of money that hasn't been appropriated correctly or this, we never hear about it. You know where we hear about it? Is we hear it on here. Oh, California didn't use the money correctly. But it never comes to us that we ever know about it till the paper gets a hold of it. Then we know about it. So, I mean, this money that has come from the federal government has put the whole state like on tippy toes, because everybody is doing it. And I know you all do a good job, but we don't hear about it until it becomes news in the newspaper. Then we hear about it. What did I want to get? The reason for
You'll
me...
hear about it in the paper. Whatever.
Yeah, I'm going to put it in the paper. But anyway, the reason is that I'm very glad that we have, I guess all of the states have had spotlights on them and where the money's going to and how we're using it. But up to now, I've got to tell you that we don't know where the money goes to just until we hear from the LAO. Okay, let's read what the LAO said.
Senator, you make an excellent point. One thing that we have just been told, and we're looping it through. We're just starting to sort of have the conversations, but it appears that the federal government is going to require the same type of reporting for any federal grants, Recovery Act or not, on a quarterly basis. So I think the lessons that we've been learning are going to be very instrumental because at its core, it is about transparency and accountability, and that's, what I think all the entities try and do, in partnership. But I just wanted to put that out because, as you're saying, it's important ours brought it. It seems that by October, anything being reported federally. I should also mention that the General Accounting Office, all of our entities are meeting with them day after day, week after week. The federal department's IGs, it's not just from the state side, but it's from the federal side to ensure all of those. And, sometimes you agree and don't, but there's a lot of things being put in place in a positive way that weren't there before, and now not just in the Recovery Act, but in broader federal, grants and awards to various states and their sub-entities. Because
the California constituencies, all of them, everybody that we represent, thinks that we know every single minute thing that is going on in the legislature. Now, some people have backgrounds in certain things, and they're very knowledgeable about certain things, but by and large, we can't know everything. And so oftentimes when something goes amiss and it gets reported in the paper and your constituencies come to you and say, well, how come you didn't know about that? And it's very hard to say we don't know everything, but they really do think we know everything about everything. They'll ask you, well, what's going on over there? And you go, that is in my district. But they really presume that we are a lot more knowledgeable than we are. And we can only be as knowledgeable as what you all tell us.
So for the record, there are members of the legislature that have a hard time saying that they don't know it all, but that none of the present company. Mr. Schultz or any of the panelists, just in terms of looking at other states, and I do think these are such extraordinary times in our lifetime, and what the administration has attempted to do, and actually, at least in terms of what we hear in both the state media but in the national media, the program has rolled out either reasonably well or nobody's catching the mistakes. So you mentioned other states, Herb. Are other states adding additional resources from their general funds for oversight, or are they pretty much doing what we have suggested the legislature, that we use the federal funds for oversight?
I think that the auditor probably can answer that better than I can, just in terms of, I think states have taken a variety of different approaches. Laura was the first in the nation IG, and there's been a lot of discussion about that at the federal level, about should other states be doing the same thing. So we like, to not only take the lessons we learn and share other people have, they may know the structures, but there's some states have used existing resources but put them in a new agency. Others have created new agencies. We happen to have tried very hard to take, what we have. We have created the Inspector General. We have done this task force, but there are hundreds upon hundreds of people who are responsible for the reporting of this money and the auditing of this money and the looking of this money. I run the task force, but behind each of those people in the task force are several hundred people in this government that are working. But again, Elaine may know, or Laura may know, from the structural standpoint, we've done it the way that the governor, I think, rightfully put it together in having a task force and IG and partnership with these. So.
Thanks, Herb, for putting me on. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, when you look at the Recovery Act itself, there was funding provided, and this was a bone of contention, to be quite honest, with state auditors across the country. The Recovery Act specifically requires, obviously, the state auditors' offices are the ones that conduct the single audit throughout the country in the various states. And what the Recovery Act did is it provided funding for the federal inspectors general, because there are several inspectors general for various federal agencies, for them to go out, because they do a lot of the work at the local level. They look at what my office does, but then they get out to school districts and local subrecipients and do that work. So the Recovery Act provided over $200 million for federal IGs to be doing work specific to the Recovery Act. Herb spoke of the Government Accountability Office. That office is basically the congressional equivalent to my office. They are the independent external auditors for Congress. They were provided about $25 million, and they selected 16 states plus the District of Columbia to do audit work. California, certainly, because we received so much stimulus money, was one of the states that GAO, as they're known as, came in and looked at. Again, they knew what we were doing at the state level. They did some work at the state level. I know they've had discussions with both Laura and Herb and his predecessor, Cynthia Bryant, but they also have done quite a bit of work out at the local level. So there was great reliance. There was actually a requirement in some of the guidance that came out that the federal agencies really lean on the state audit shops, state auditors, because we do the single audit year after. We've been doing it for 20 years. And I think what the Recovery Act has done, as Herb indicated, is really shine the spotlight on the single audit, because we are looking at federal dollars on an annual basis, and we've been doing the single audit since 1985. That's when that act came into place. And it's rare that the state of California, I can't recall, in my 10 years as a state auditor, I don't recall the state of California ever having to send money back. There has certainly been questionable costs, but the federal government comes into my office and looks at the work that we do to make sure that we're doing what they want us to do as far as following standards, et cetera. As far as other states creating, to my knowledge, Laura's the only Inspector General that's been created. Again, that's to my knowledge, but there have been other states that have taken individuals from certain entities like the state auditor, the state controller, or in some cases it's called the state comptroller, and created something similar to what California did as far as the task force, pulling people from cabinet level positions who would meet, as they do, I think daily or weekly, to really get a handle on how well are we managing all the federal money coming into the state. So I know that other states have created something very similar to the task force. To my knowledge, Laura, again, is the only Inspector General. But again, I don't know if other states have actually created something unique. And part of the problem is, that's why I talked about the money that was provided in the Recovery Act. There was not funding specifically required or provided in the Recovery Act for things to be happening at the state level. And that's when OMB, because of pressure from my organization, it's called State Auditor, Comptrollers, and Treasurers NASAC, we really pressured Washington and said, you expect us to do all this additional audit work, you've got to provide some relief or some ability for the state to be able to, bill that back essentially to the federal government, and that's the 0.5% that's referred to in the analysis and what will be able to fund some of this, because essentially we'll bill much of this back to the federal government, but there are limits on what the federal government is willing to pay for. So I hope that answered your question.
Finance, you indicated some interest.
Echoing some of the things that the auditor said, the Office of Management and Budget has approved our plan actually at a much higher level than those dollars that are before you today. They actually approved our oversight proposal that included the newly created Inspector General, the task force, the BSA's role, the controller's role at much higher levels. The challenge that we have, and other states are doing the same, most states were able, though, because they had such a small amount of ARA dollars, they, put in requests and got the 0.5%. California, in some respects, hurt themselves, but helped themselves. We got money to flow out the door very quickly. So that, unfortunately, because we were getting it out on the street and doing what the Recovery Act required, made it so that funds went out the door before we could set aside that 0.5%. 0.5% against the $55 billion that's expected to come into the state would be $275 million. The request before you is, very modest and under $30 million. Part of it is the challenge in terms of how we recovered. We're recovering far greater in our federal fund recoveries for these central service oversight costs than we do in our typical central services recovery. I don't want to bore you with the details, but we're actually doing a phenomenal job of recovering, and ARA has presented a unique opportunity for us to do that. Some departments, because it's been a difficult, trying process working with OMB and trying to come up with a recovery mechanism so that we could ensure as much as or as close to 100% recovery as possible of these costs, have not bothered. So they didn't want to amend their statewide cost allocation recovery plans in order to get the federal participation, so they've absorbed these kinds of costs. The real thought that I'd like to leave you with, though, is that this is a balance between the level of risk that you're willing to assume and the appropriate level of oversight to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. And we really have put together, as an administration, a very credible plan that approaches and hits those different areas. The focus of the BSA is primarily single audits. They've accelerated their process because typically the single audit is far too late to be able to correct anything that they highlight. The controllers, the same thing. Those things that are now coming out of the Bureau of State Audits, both the Inspector General and the task force, including utilization of the Office of State Audits and Evaluation and Finance, allow us to correct those problems early on in the process. And I think the more that we can get in front of those issues, the more we can get out and do subrecipient monitoring, which is the primary focus of the Inspector General, and getting down more into the weeds and not necessarily looking at paper-based reports from a single audit, help us to be able to correct problems before they occur.
Thank you. That was great. And I don't think that's inconsistent with what the legislature wants, or I can remember having this discussion a year ago when we talked about the balance of the urgency of the situation, getting the money out quickly, but having the proper oversight. And I think, at least from the knowledge I know, that the legislature knows, we've done a good job about that. The issue today, and the staff recommendation, is to prove the LAO's recommendation is not a reflection of anyone's talents or abilities. It's more the relationship, as the LAO, I think, has appropriately put it out, that when we do reorganizations, the relationship between the executive branch of government and the legislative branch of government. And I know just from my side, trying to do reform on this side, won't work if we don't have an executive branch engaged in the conversation. So it goes both ways. So while I think there's definitely a role, and you've played a good role for the IG in these, I guess the three things are, where is the appropriate level is to making it work right in a synergy with all the organizations. As I remember when we had the Reform Committee in Los Angeles, when both of you were there along with Mr. Taylor, just looking at that sort of org chart of oversight of, and we've all talked about this is in the next few years, hopefully talking about that to make the IG's role work with the auditor work. And I think probably what we're going through now is trying to find that level, both culturally but also systemically. So how do we arrange that? And then there's the other issue about the next item in OPR, where, at least for myself, I have some issues, so that we're going to continue to have that discussion with the administration in this committee, but it will also play out at the full budget, and I assume with discussions between the pro tem, the speaker, and the minority leaders and the governor. So with that, any other comments? The recommendation, Senator, is to approve the LAO recommendation, thereby reducing the governor's 2010-11 ARA oversight expenditure request by $2.2 million as detailed in our report, including the adoption of the provisional language related to an ARA oversight reserve. Are you okay with that? All right. The record will show that then this item goes out 2-0. Again, Mr. Schultz, good luck with San Francisco, the federal government, and your therapist. No, the next item, all other items are going to be hold open items. Is there anything in particular you would like us to take next? The plan is to go to OPR next. Okay. Sure. Did you have some comments about redistricting, the redistricting initiative? Did you want to take that out of order? Right. Okay. So we'll go to OPR. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for indulging my humor. So the rest of the agenda are reports, and the recommendations are to hold them open to continue to have discussions. And we'll start with item number 2, which has become item number 3, which is the Office of Planning and Research. And we're going to start with the LAO.
The administration proposes to eliminate the Office of Planning and Research. This is a discussion that began in earnest last year in conference committee when the governor pointed out his desire to rid the state of this office. Our office has long recommended eliminating the office. The challenge, and I think you alluded to it in some of your comments, is that OPR over the years has collected kind of a motley bunch of activities, not entirely connected, some of which I think there is substantial consensus, at least some consensus, to downsize or eliminate, and others of which are quite more challenging to deal with. So the challenge with this proposal, if the legislature pursues it, is what to eliminate, which leads to the discussion of how much general fund savings there would be. The administration's proposal would eliminate about 13 positions and generate $571,000 of savings. We recommend eliminating about 5 more for an additional a few $100,000 of savings. And then the question goes, what remains? Where does it go to if the office is eliminated? And I think that the discussion comes down. There are a number of different discussions that could be had, but in particular, the discussion of California volunteers, which we will, I think, have a little bit later in the agenda, but also an entity in the Office of Planning and Research called the CEQA State Clearinghouse, which also deals with planning activities and various environmental activities. OPR, through this entity, plays a fairly central role in state processes related to CEQA. In some senses, it's fairly technical, but it's very important. The office traditionally has played a fairly neutral role in between various stakeholders related to CEQA issues, and plays an important role in distributing paperwork related to CEQA throughout state departments. Under the administration's proposal, that function would go to the Natural Resources Agency. We think that's the best place to move it. We're certainly open to other ideas about where to move it. It's too small to kind of be a standalone entity if the legislature eliminates OPR, but it's in a sense too intertwined, too important under existing statutes to eliminate. There are also in statutes a number of duties for OPR related to reports, land use planning, various types of activities of that nature. Not all of those are addressed in the administration's trailer bill language, and so our suggestion would be that the legislature direct the administration at or before May revision to come back with each one of those statutory areas and propose what should happen to it. They may wish to propose eliminating some functions, scaling back some functions. They may like to take the existing statutory language and move it to another department, but it's kind of difficult to have the entire conversation without knowing what exactly would happen to those various other responsibilities, which often are in the environment and land use area. So I think that's the summary. If the legislature pursues this route, there's just a lot of moving of boxes that has to occur about whatever the legislature preserves out of the office.
Okay, I'll take that as an amendment to your recommendation that if it continues to exist, it will change its name to the Office of Motley Collection of Issues. or the acronym OMC. Finance, do you have anything on this item?
Jennifer Osborne, Department of Finance. We would just note, I'm guessing as you go through the agenda that, and OPR will discuss some of the issues, but what we would just like to point out is that on the agenda asks about the rent situation at the OPR building, and what we would say would be that currently, under current law, the Department of General Services, when an agency moves away, they're basically on the hook to pay the rent until the tenancy is backfilled. But in this case, because the proposal is to eliminate the agency, essentially the DGS would have to eat the cost to the extent that they cannot find a tenant, or until they can find a tenant. The practical outcome of that would be that they have a large building rental account that this would go into, but that is a reason why the earlier that this is acted on, the better, so that they can begin planning and looking for a tenant.
Do you know if General Services has, for instance, we've had the real estate commissioner in here for a couple of years looking for a new location. Do we have a process where they identify departments like real estate that, if they're not perfect fits?
I'm not clear on what, I don't know what Department of Real Estate has done, but typically when General Services, most state departments do have to go through them when they're seeking space to occupy, and so assuming that department is also subject to that, I would imagine that they're aware of it.
Okay. Welcome.
Thank you.
How do you like your new name?
Well, we are a mighty motley crew, I guess.
People say worse things about the legislature. So.
Well, Kathleen Cox, Acting Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. The Governor is proposing to eliminate OPR and transferring, that's in an effort to streamline government. The proposal is to transfer OPR's critical functions to other agencies. And we do recognize that there are myriad pieces to OPR, and we'll work with the legislature to ensure that stakeholders and the legislature itself are part of the decisions about where the key functions go, particularly the statewide planning and the land use coordination functions that we currently do. And we just want to make sure, we'll be working with everyone to make sure that those functions are continued in the appropriate venues at the right levels to create efficiencies, effectiveness, and help with implementation.
Okay. Questions? I have a few, and this is meant in the spirit of, as we hold it open, the things that the committee would expect to hear back. Having spent some time in your predecessor's office, your office, Ms. Bryant's office, and having had a long-term interest in better on the issues of CEQA and planning, land use planning, and having spent a good deal of time studying best practices in other states and other industrialized countries, those functions seem to consistently work better when they're in the executive office, not in a cabinet level. And of course, we've struggled with this. So my reading of the history of the department was when it began in the first Brown administration, it actually, maybe because that administration was the author of it, at a time when I think appropriately, with 16 million fewer people in the state of California, the then Jerry Brown administration wanted a plan for it. It's ironic we're here all these years later with 16 million more people, projected for 16 million more people, and of course he's running for office and may if he's successful, come into a situation where the department he started no longer exists when he comes in. And I assume that there'd be some interest, and certainly some interest on my part personally, to make sure that the planning doesn't as fragmented and dysfunctional, in my words, that the coordination between the state and local government has been when it comes to CEQA implementation and land use doesn't actually get worse. And at least my reading of history and looking at other jurisdictions and other states and countries, taking it out of the executive branch, the physical presence, will make it harder. Do you just respond to that? And then, of course, respond to this when you come back. So with some editorial comment, perhaps when you come back as well, along with where the functions will go.
Well, the proposal is to move the director into the executive branch, into the governor's office, to help maintain that level of priority with respect to the land planning. So just as it does today, the director coordinates amongst the silos in government. So we don't expect that to change, but we do know that there are myriad pieces within the codes that will have to be addressed to make sure that they're in the right spots and with the right oversight.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to you coming back with a more detailed explanation of how those functions from a micro standpoint will work, and the gestalt of having the executive officer trying to coordinate those, even though our history hasn't been too good through multiple administrations since the inception of OPR. Okay. Is there public comment on this item? Yes.
Try to make this as brief as possible. I know you've got a lot of work ahead of you, but I'm Alan Lind. I'm here on behalf of the Association of Environmental Professionals, and I'm also a recovering member of several motley crews. I used to work in the Assembly, and I used to work in OPR, so I have some familiarity with the issues here. AEP, Association of Environmental Professionals, thinks that re-examining the functions of OPR is a terrific idea. It probably needs to be done. My guys have been working with OPR for the past 30 years because they're the ones that handle the CEQA documents, whether they're from the public agencies or the consulting firms that provide those documents to OPR, and have worked the CEQA guidelines over the years. And I can attest to you that OPR has always done a terrific job of a balanced and fair treatment of the CEQA guidelines. It is important to so many different constituencies, whether they be local governments or the project proponents or state agencies and others, to move OPR. Your remarks are, of course, music to my ears, because the notion of moving OPR to any mission-driven agency runs the risk of putting, let's just call it a cloud or an influence over the operations of OPR. So if the state clearinghouse and planning unit was transferred to the resources agency or business and transportation or health and welfare or Cal EPA, any one of those agencies has their own legitimate biases as to achieving certain public policies. But the job of the state clearinghouse and the planning unit is to balance all of that input. So that's why we think, actually, returning to the original objectives of OPR, to be a state office of planning and research and to handle the very important things that go on with CEQA, is an extremely high priority and not something to be treated lightly. And we feel that there hasn't been enough thought gone into the significance and the importance of those roles. I'd just like to mention just a couple of really important emerging issues that OPR is working on right now. There's, of course, the integration of greenhouse gas emission considerations in the CEQA. They just did a terrific job on the CEQA guidelines. There's more work that can be done in that area as well. Another important area that they're involved in is, of course, the sustainable communities and strategic planning. And I think you have a bill in this subject area that relies heavily on the, let's call it the independence of OPR to carry out. So there are a number of other cross-cutting issues that invariably come before OPR, and frankly, last year's budget, the legislature saw fit to augment it by $1 billion to accommodate the ARA funding coming through. it became, I think, in the view of the legislature, a logical place to handle something like that, an unanticipated event that an office like OPR can accommodate. There are, of course, a number of bills introduced in this legislative session and in previous legislative sessions that have been expanding the responsibility of OPR, and these have originated with the legislature, not so much the administration. I think one of the important bills that is before the legislature now is, Mr. Chairman, your bill, SB 1445, that relies on OPR to expand planning assistance, the Planning Assistance and Advisory Council, and I think that's an excellent idea. Senator Ducheney's SB 959 touches on certain matters that would that would be best handled by OPR, by an independent OPR. Senator Hollingsworth has SB 1293 that makes a lot of sense with an independent OPR, and I can mention SB 1207. Senator Keel, likewise, would benefit from having an independent OPR. There are a number of bills in the Assembly as well. So I think a lot of these things point towards, we want to be very cautious with how we treat the state clearinghouse and the planning unit. And from my perspective, I think the original intent of the Office of Planning and Research should be sustained. I think that it was correct at the time. I respect the analyst's concern that it might be too small to call it an office, but there's a lot of small offices in state government that do the same kinds of things. The governor has an Office of Education with about just 1 or 2 people in it, I think. So I don't think that smallness is a criteria for when you create or not create something or sustain something. And I think this is certainly worthy of sustaining. There are many functions at OPR on the books for the State Clearinghouse and the Planning Unit that frankly aren't getting the attention that they deserve. And so a future administration that may wish to get more involved in planning would have the opportunity to execute that in the executive office and accomplish the things that we've all had our hearts and minds set on for land use planning. So we urge you to take this very cautiously, seriously, and frankly, I hope that there will be an engagement of the stakeholders who are not people in the building here to explore ways of making the most efficient use of those resources.
Thank you for your comments.
Excuse me, Sandy George, representing the American Planning Association, and basically what he said and what you said. We very much agree. We do not think that OPR should be dismantled. The fragmenting of all of these very important services to local government right now, when we're just going through SB 375 and AB 32 implementation, we think is very short-sighted. We don't think it serves local government well, and we don't think it serves the state very well. And we think one of the reasons why there are so many bills in the legislature that point to OPR is because they're very even-handed. They have open and public processes. They go very far in their ability to their goals to outreach to people, and as a result, they come up with really good guidelines. The clearinghouse is always considered something that is understaffed and underfunded, and in spite of that, they do a great job. Just about everything on the list of services that they currently provide are important to all of us. We don't want to see them fragmented and diluted, and we think now is the time to review what the state wants out of OPR rather than dismantling it and removing additional people that could be used to assist the state.
Okay. So does the LAO want to recant their comments about motley issues?
Well, no, I think that as indicated earlier, I think that we've heard nothing but really praise for the part of OPR that is frankly the most challenging here, the CEQA clearinghouse and planning unit. And it is indeed a challenge that we began to confront with conference committee last year on if this initiative moves forward, how to deal with it. I would just point out, and heard your comments about the benefits of having the planning coordination functions in the executive office, and there surely are some. One of the unique features of OPR is that under statute and organizationally, it is effectively part of the governor's office. Its staff is exempt from civil service. And that means that frankly, in our experience, the legislature deals with the office in a different way, with frankly, a higher degree of deference than it does to other offices. And so, on the one hand, there are advantages, perhaps, of having this sort of function in the executive office. On the other hand, in terms of legislative oversight, there may be advantages to having it somewhere else. And so that's one thing that weighs on our mind as we think about how the legislature should proceed on this particular issue. But clearly, I think that as we've gone through it the past year, this particular function is the most challenging what to do with it.
Any other comments? Well, I just I look forward to you coming back. Happy to have any discussions about it, just because it is an area of interest. And I think it's something that's always struck me as being incredibly ironic and sad that since the office was created, in all those years of tremendous growth in California and the projected growth for the next 35 years, just on the natural, that and I think maybe the LAO has just hit on something unique. I mean, the idea with it being exempt from civil service allowed it for an issue that's both very technical but very political, particularly in a dynamic where you've got so much pressure on growth, which in spite of the economy we continue to have. Somewhere in there lies the right mix, and then somewhere structurally is the right mix. So we look forward to your suggestions, because I do think, and this is just a very strong feeling for myself, and I believe the pro tem, that the idea of simply disembodying the functions and just putting them in bureaucratic boxes won't work for the legislature. That there's too important a function that's never really been realized consistently in terms of a coordinating place. And I would include not just with local government and regional agencies, but also with the federal government. And I've had multiple conversations with multiple administrators from EPA and the Department of Transportation, both in the Clinton administration and subsequent to that, of how poorly we coordinate with Region 9 sometimes in terms of our planning functions. So where all of that would go, given the demands on us, and then the political aspects of at-will appointees that can come in various shapes, sizes, and degrees of competency with the civil service function. And then lastly, it's nothing against the people at HCD in particular, and it might be more the functions that they have to deal with the arena numbers coming from local government, where most of the local government was never happy with those numbers. Just trying to get this all right is going to be a challenge, so good luck.
Thank you.
I hope that's enough of a warning.
I think so.
Well, if we get it right, it would be a tremendous thing.
Absolutely.
And who knows, I may be wrong. Thank you.
Thanks.
That will take us to the next item, the California Agency on Service and Volunteering, another reorganization.
With this proposal, the administration proposes legislation to establish the California Agency on Service and Volunteering, effectively converting California volunteers in office now within OPR to the agency level. The office has currently a little over 40 authorized positions. This is an office that has a roughly $1 million general fund budget, a little less this year because of the furloughs, but is key in generating roughly 30 times that amount in federal funds that flows from AmeriCorps, VISTA, and related service projects throughout California. That high degree of federal match compels us, in our opinion, to continue that office for the economic and societal benefits that are achieved from that money. Converting it to an agency, though, is one of the really strange requests we've seen in some time. This is 40 positions. Agencies have thousands and thousands of positions. So in terms of governmental structure and basic government theory, that doesn't work. In fact, this would be very small for a department. In fact, could generate additional overhead costs there. We would recommend, upon OPR's elimination, that it be placed within a department. We've suggested HCD, but obviously there could be other options as well. One of the rationales that, as we've tried to figure out why the administration would make this proposal, really came down to two things. The governor has, on his own, without legislative approval, designated the former executive director position of California Volunteers as the Secretary for Service and Volunteering. That is not the governor's job. The legislature, we have government organization committees in this building. We have processes for government reorganization plans. And in particular, for this body, when the governor takes it upon his own initiative to designate a person at that level, it can effectively reduce the ability of the Senate through the confirmation process to ensure that executive branch officials are the type of people that the Senate is comfortable having in those positions. That's nothing with regard to the current incumbents. It's just as a basic process matter, the legislature decides what are departments and agencies, who has secretaries. The legislature, in fact, has delegated salary-setting responsibilities for secretaries to the executive branch. Upon this action, the current administration did not elevate the salary of the executive of California Volunteers, but a future administration under this setup easily could, and the legislature would then be left with an individual heading this very small office with a salary that's disproportionate to his or her responsibilities. The other thing that's been brought up is lifting the profile of volunteerism. That, too, is not really a function of government organization. How the legislature chooses to structure the government is designed for many purposes, but among the key purposes are accountability and ensuring the orderly function of government, the efficient distribution of overhead responsibilities. Really, none of those rationales that we have heard or can think of can possibly justify creating an agency here. So we recommend that proposal be roundly rejected, and that instead, if OPR is eliminated, California Volunteers be placed within an existing department at a flat funding level with a reduced executive structure consistent with being inside of a department and not its own department or agency.
Thank you, Jason. You've clearly enjoyed analyzing these proposals.
I think he called us strange.
Yeah, well, somewhere James Madison is looking down on you very proudly. Finance, do you have any comments?
I'll just defer to the secretary, as I believe she can hit it more on the points that that the LAO has raised. But as usual, we would support the proposal and believe as well that the funding proposal in terms of moving some of the administrative funding and positions from OPR is appropriate, given that those activities will continue for this agency.
All right. Pardon the pun. Would you volunteer some comments?
Absolutely. Good afternoon. My name is Karen Baker, and I serve as the Secretary of Service and Volunteering. I head California Volunteers, which is the state entity responsible for increasing the amount and the impact of volunteering in the state. California Volunteers is the state's service commission. We administer the federal AmeriCorps dollars, which most of you understand is the domestic Peace Corps. The purpose of AmeriCorps dollars is to really solve local community issues. And those problems that AmeriCorps resources are put against range from trying to deal with low high school graduation rates, restoration projects in the environment, increasing access to health care, quite a wide variety of issues. In addition to AmeriCorps, we're responsible for managing all volunteers and coordinating donations in times of disaster. Further, we manage a website that has over 50,000 volunteer opportunities. It has grown quite exponentially. It's called CaliforniaVolunteers.org, and this really connects Californians to the issues that they care about. I'm here today to really discuss the governor's budget proposal, to really codify what's already been at work, the current work of California Volunteers as the California Agency on Service and Volunteering. And I think it will position us to take advantage of the anticipated tripling of AmeriCorps over the next 7 years. The agency proposal does not create any new programs and requests a minor increase in state funding to support administrative functions currently provided by the Office of Planning and Research. Our proposed budget for 2010-11 fiscal year is $34.2 million, and the roughly 40 personnel years. We are almost entirely supported by federal funds, 97% federally funded, our agency. The majority of our $1 million, roughly, in general funds does provide that required match for a federal administrative grant. We believe this proposal could not come at a more opportune time for this state. We believe that service and volunteering is critical in solving the state's most pressing problems. I think we all know government cannot do it alone, and the Agency on Service and Volunteering will continue to serve as an asset for Californians and nonprofits alike. In these tough economic times, it's our nonprofits and our faith-based groups that are on the front lines really, really trying to meet these local needs, and they need more volunteers to do the work. It's easy to think of volunteering as a nice to do, but it's really become a necessity in our communities. The state has over 7 million volunteers. Basically, 1 in 4 Californians volunteer. And whether you're one of the thousands that turned out in the Bay Area, rolling up your sleeves to clean up the Costco Busan oil spill, or you're an AmeriCorps member right here in Sacramento that works with high-risk families that are struggling with child abuse issues, and you're turning that around so they don't have repeat incidents, or whether you're a company like The Gap and many other companies that are really galvanized by this volunteerism movement and are doing very exciting activity. At The Gap, for example, employees are working with at-risk youth, teaching them basic job preparedness and interview skills and job retention skills. And then the youth that are successful in completing the program often get hired by The Gap. This is a very vibrant area. Federal funding to support service and volunteerism is growing thanks to the Edward M. Kennedy Serve America Act that was signed into law by President Obama just last year. Thousands of recent retirees view service as a vital part of their retirement plans, and more youth believe volunteering is a critical part of what defines them as a generation. Clearly, service is a growth industry, leading me to my final 3 points and why we believe adopting the governor's proposal makes really good sense. First, the state general fund represents a mere 3% of our agency budget. This minimal investment returns significant value for the state. We've been successful in securing more than $30 million in federal funding with the $1 million investment our state makes. Second, our footprint is as varied as the Californians who live here. The issues that we are working with vary from disaster relief to helping kids graduate from high school to planting trees in their community. We need to be positioned in a place where we can work across issues and with enough profile where Californians, nonprofits, and business leaders alike know where to turn when they want to find a volunteer opportunity or build public-private partnerships to leverage the assets of their workforce. And finally, there are those that will say that a staff of 40 does not lend itself to agency status. However, our true resources are over the 7 million Californians that volunteer and the more than $20 billion in service that they provide on an annual basis. Further, these volunteers serve in nonprofit schools and faith-based organizations representing a significant portion of our state, all who will continue to benefit from a state agency positioned to strengthen and grow volunteer efforts throughout the state. By defining us as a distinct agency, we are telling the people of California that their contributions matter. We have big, diverse, and hairy problems that need the energy and talents of Californians. And the Agency on Service and Volunteering will serve as a resource to turn that passion into action. And I could take any questions you might have.
That was very well said. Inspiring. I'm tempted to go back to Jason now because the two of you are so articulate and passionate on your own views. What has functionally happened here, we are going to hold it open. We have lost our quorum in any case, so we won't deny the language.
Okay.
So that's good news.
That's beautiful.
And would also like to somehow engage you and the administration in the discussion. I think it's, whether it's appropriate to be an agency or not, I think is a legitimate question, but the goals are, I think, right on. And
yeah.
I would go, and actually, ironically, sitting here watching and thinking about the previous discussion, OPR, in my mind's eye, why the functions of land use at OPR and planning are so important, because it goes to the issue of what Tocqueville talked about when he came to America and said the genius of America is the engagement of average Americans in civic
right.
engagement. And how we've gotten away from that, personally, I think is partially because of how we build communities, and there are other things, technology. And it's often ironic to me that in this technological age, we are less connected than ever vis-a-vis the things you're talking about. For those people who do volunteer, lots of it is because of good employers, like the Gap, or like state government, or like county governments.
It's amazing.
But the value added to that is no different now than it was in the late 1700s or early 1800s, when this was a very different nation. So in some ways, when I think of what your goal is, my inclination is to think that Jason is right. We should have a bigger agency, that it should become maybe the eventually, but of course the revenue has to be there, is how do you get Californians re-engaged in the democratic process, including not just civic engagement, but the requirement to volunteer. And then where's the best place for that? I mean, the Red Cross raises money and I don't think anybody questions that they are an extraordinary organization, separate and apart from government, but works well with FEMA and Cal EMA. So again, it's just how do we get this right to make it work? So I take your comments and the spirit of the administration, both the governor and the first lady, consistent with what Senator Kennedy believed, that this was something important, much more important just in volunteering, but the fabric of the success or failure of American democracy. So in those kind of ways, I get it. I get why we want to heighten.
Yeah, the profile, if I could comment on just that part of it. I think you very wisely pointed out there are certain functions that lend themselves to be placed within the executive branch. And one thing that we have really, frankly, enjoyed since our inception in 1994, we've always been part of OPR and therefore the governor's office. And I will let you know, we would be open to remaining there. If not as a separate agency, we would be open to remaining as part of the governor's office. But I will let you know that anywhere other than a separate agency or the governor's office, in my mind, really does present a number of problems. First of all, we have enjoyed the profile that the executive offers, regardless of who's been governor. That's really mattered to the volunteers and to the work that we do. And it's the message that it's sending to our citizenry, that you are as important as the governor, if you will, at the executive level. I think that's a really important message. We've also, because of this, and I have the unique opportunity to have both served for 5 years now, both when I was an executive director in this role and now as a secretary. And if I could speak to the secretary role for a moment, there has been a significant change in what I can leverage and broker as a secretary of service and volunteering versus what I could broker as an executive director in the governor's office. And I think it's really important that the legislature understands that. As just an example, the California Endowment recently supported us with over $3 million worth of match funds to our AmeriCorps grant so that we can go out there into the 14 healthy communities that they're doing focused work on and use service as a strategy so that they can literally bring AmeriCorps members from their own communities to impact health issues in these very poor communities. We're able now, because of the raised profile, to attract foundation funding. Prior to this, we've never had more than $100,000 from any foundation. Now I can go out and secure $3 million. This is for grants purposes, I will clarify. Also, you've got the private sector that has really responded to this title. You know, I come from the nonprofit world, run homeless agencies most of my life. I can tell you the title I was actually fairly uncomfortable with. And it wasn't until I recognized, my goodness, what this means in the private sector and their sudden interest and the validation of their kind of coming to the table and wanting to be a part of it, it's really made a difference. We have over 35 Fortune 500 companies that are part of our Business Partners program that now want to invest in and be a part of employee approaches to solving problems in communities. We never had that. It's because we're above the radar. And that's what the office provides. I understand that the creation of agencies is a legislative function. I certainly give you that. But I will let you know, being a part of the governor's office is critical in this. And being buried in a department with a one issue kind of focus like housing or wherever you would potentially place us is far too limiting when our issues are so broad.
That's well said.
Yeah.
Maybe you can be the secretary of Office of Planning and Communities, and I am not insensitive to the title, the importance of the title.
Yeah.
I mean, the title I now have. I've had several political titles, and this is the first one that I was mayor for 4 months, and everybody thought that was a cool job.
That was pretty cool.
But nobody knew what a county supervisor was or an assembly member, so.
You know.
Yeah, people frequently ask me what it's like to work with John McCain, and I have to tell them I don't know. But that goes to a whole other issue about civic engagement and people being involved. So.
And strategies, yeah.
We're going to hold it open. There are certainly the spirit, I agree with, but there are some problematic issues that we would like you to respond to that you already have in a little more detail. And it goes with, obviously, the previous discussion of, but from a fiscal standpoint, identifying where the savings are. And then to the secondary degree, sort of the value added of whatever this reorganization looks like, how we're going to save money, but how we're actually going to deliver services in a different way. And you sort of alluded to some of your experience already. So.
Yeah, and just a point of also clarification on my transition from executive director to the secretary. I was offered a secretary salary. I declined that pay increase of $40,000. So it wasn't that wasn't considered, but just to clarify that.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hold on just a second. Do we want to ask LAO about the continuing appropriations? Do you have any comments on that?
The governor's budget recommends, as part of the agency transition here in the trailer bill, to establish a continuously appropriated fund, the California Volunteers Fund, for the acceptance of donations in cash or in kind to the agency. We agree with the staff comments. Even if we saw a reason for this, the proposals drafted would give the agency, the secretary, and therefore the governor far too much power to move privately solicited funds through state government. As a better example, California volunteers and indeed the governor really are better suited to help existing local and other nonprofit entities, as well as in some cases local governments, identify funds. Running them through the executive branch in a fund with this much power would be ill-advised, we think.
Any response?
Oh, yeah. First of all, a little background.
Might be actually a source of revenue. We could have the two of you go out.
That's right. That's right. Very thoughtful office. First of all, it's very important to understand some history here. When this was decided to kind of both combine our role in coordinating volunteers in times of disaster along with kind of serving as a collection point for donations, it was done in light of two realities. FEMA, first of all, does the same thing. It combines those functions. So we looked at the federal model and recognized that. We also looked at the reality of the everyday Californian, which guides most of our thinking. And when you're an everyday Californian and you see Southern California fires, all you know is you want to give. Sometimes you want to give time, you want to give money, you want to give stuff. And so what we recognized is it made sense to have one central, if you will, clearinghouse for that function. because in one experience on the web, you can get access and be able to do all of those three things. Now, what we did also recognize is exactly what he raised, which is like, when is it appropriate for us, and especially with the potential appearance that the governor or his exempt employees to be tossing around dollars, when and under what circumstances is that appropriate? If you look at the history of when we have opted to post that there is, in essence, a governor's disaster fund, we've only done it once. The total dollars raised was $10,000 that was able to be distributed in a very important example to Lutheran services. And the reason why it's important to note this is, although the American Red Cross is a phenomenal organization, as is the Salvation Army, when you get into the business of disaster, you will learn that there are a lot of players out there, not just those two very large entities. And that depending on the community, what you're dealing with, and the need that you have, like in the example that I'm about to cite, a mobile home park needed to be cleaned up and case management needed to be delivered to the families in this community. It would have been out of mission for the American Red Cross to handle those two functions. They do not do that. They were not specifically in this area, and that was not their function in this area. And it was, in fact, Lutheran services that were there. And the only reason we did not go with the posting of the American Red Cross, et cetera, we always, by the way, list those separate agencies as options. So people always have that option to get linked immediately to the private nonprofit. This is just for those Californians who frankly trust government. Yes, there are some out there that trust government to be more knowledgeable about where dollars would be appropriate to go in times of a disaster incident. In this case, it would have been inappropriate to give it to the American Red Cross. That's where we've been very careful. We've also are currently writing, for the purposes of Calima's state plan, specific protocols that call out that no dollars will be ever distributed over $100,000 in total for any one incident to any entity without having it go through the local community foundation. Because we believe a local community foundation that sets up a recovery committee is best equipped with its knowledge of the local community to decide who are the right players in a community that should receive dollars. You know, do you need money to rebuild sewer systems, to down trees, to provide case management, to relocate families? It's completely different with every disaster. So this is actually an expertise. Knowledge of community is an expertise. Calima supported this, and that's a very important thing to note. They recognize their sweet spot is in those first responder space. We can get you the fire trucks, we'll get you the helicopters, we'll get you whatever it is that is needed. But what they recognize is the challenge of being knowledgeable about nonprofits, community, faith-based is in fact our expertise. And we work with local partners in doing that.
You know, you bring up a good point, and I think it's worthy of a little bit of feedback. Just how, after September 11th, when I was in county government, we went through an assessment around the state about emergency response.
Yes.
And the general response we had in the Bay Area was this is one function of government that in California was very well organized, that the public safety people. So how you would how you do and how you would interrelate to a county or regional level on emergency response, but then also the local volunteer centers. How do you, doing this in an agency, how does this all better coordinate? Because at least my recollection is the regions and the counties were pretty happy having it at that level, and as you just indicated, it's probably the best place to have it. And if you go back to the wise Frenchman who came and observed America, de Tocqueville's thing was that one of the things about volunteerism in America, which was consistent with the founders, was it wasn't in government. that they had. They're third party. They were the Masons, and whether you like them or not. So I don't.
How does that all work?
Part of it is
it's great.
It's
question.
great that you get the level up. I get that part.
Yeah.
But the functioning of it is, do you make it worse?
Yeah.
And that would be worthy of some kind of. In addition to the fiscal response about where we're going to save money, where OPR is going, the dangers that I think the LAO has appropriately brought up is you bring level up, the costs go up, but do the services improve? And if services don't improve, there's no point in moving you to a cabinet secretary.
No, I appreciate what you're bringing up and raising. A couple of things. First of all, our relationship at the local level. All disasters are local. They have to be managed by our local emergency managers. They're the first line. Whenever an incident occurs and is first identified, what we put up on the CaliforniaVolunteers.org website is a widget that immediately connects you to the local volunteer center and to the local emergency management office that's handling that incident. But because often in California with our wildfires and earthquakes, it can quickly cross county lines. We frequently have to have that ability to be able to tout a number of, quote, local resources, because the incidents are often grander than just that small, single county, footprint. So that's why it makes sense in my mind that we play this role, because of just the nature of the kinds of disasters that California faces. We have in our California Volunteers Matching Network, our website, is a partnership between 30 volunteer centers. They are the ones that feed us all those volunteer opportunities. They're all part of a very active partnership, and they're currently involved in a partnership that also connects them with their county emergency managers. So that they are the ones that are handling spontaneous volunteers in disasters and incidents. So I just want to encourage you. What I love about your philosophy, if you will, around citizen service, because this does get kind of to a philosophical kind of conversation. The way we've always approached it is very much our role is convener and broker. And when I say broker, it's quickly list who is the right local person and have the profile of a big state entity that you can be a part of, but then Californian A comes to us to get connected down to the local level. We connect them and we let it go. That's what the role of state government should be. That's what we're doing in this specific space with disaster, and that's why CalEMA has been so supportive. I've been recently just appointed to the National Preparedness Task Force by Janet Napolitano, one of 2 Californians, and the only one representing the volunteer space. And I'm telling you, this is spreading, not to excuse the metaphor, like wildfire. This volunteerism movement in the disaster world is becoming a significant fourth leg on the stool of mutual aid. It's not just law, fire, and public health. It's volunteerism. And it's because communities are saying, our people want to help save our beaches when there's a Costco Busan oil spill. Volunteers have to be in the mix. And there's an expertise there that we can provide.
Thanks. I think you and I could go on for hours.
I know.
We've already gone on too
Thank
long.
you.
So thank everybody else for indulging us this discussion. So we will ask staff and the LAO to continue to work with you to flush out some of these issues, and be happy to have an open mind about it.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All right, last item. Speaking of volunteerism, the California Citizens Redistricting Initiative. Okay. And as you come forward, I'm asked by staff to just read into the record a correction to this agenda item. Figure 3 on page 19 illustrates the required schedule of actions of the state auditor, legislature, secretary of state, and the commission under Prop 11. Figure 3 states that the legislature must act no later than November 1st, 2010 to exercise up to 24, in quote, strikes. The correct date is no later than November 15th, 2010. You're welcome. Welcome back. Sorry to keep you so long.
Thank you. No problem. Did you want me to start, or do you want LAO?
Yes, we start with the LAO. I'm sorry. I'm still Jason, you're not going to opine on this one? I'm sort of looking forward to it.
Diego Martin, Legislative Analyst's Office. I think the staff does a good job synthesizing the issue and the agenda, and so I'm going to try to keep my comments brief but to the point. So the voters approved Proposition 11 in November 2008, which, among other things, created a new redistricting process. It also created a 14-member Citizens Redistricting Commission. In last year's budget, 2009-10 Budget Act, the legislature appropriated $3 million to be spent over 3 years to cover some of the costs of this commission. Last September, I believe, the Joint Legislative Budget Committee set aside $500,000 of this amount to the BSA to cover some of their costs in assembling the members of the commission. Recently, the BSA estimated that it will cost about $3.5 million to do that function. So in addition to the $500,000, the Bureau of State Audits has said they will be able to fund the rest of the amount in their existing appropriation in the State Audit Fund through some savings they're able to find. So that leaves the Commission with $2.5 million to fund the rest of its costs. The Governor's proposal includes an extra $3 million appropriation on top of the $2.5 that's remaining to cover the Commission's costs. So I guess I would first note there's inherent difficulties in estimating the cost for this newly established commission. This is California's first time with an independent commission. This is a function that's traditionally or always been done by the legislature. So trying to come up with this new process to put together the commission and the commission's actual cost is kind of difficult to arrive at. But we think that the $2.5 million remaining from last year's Budget Act should be enough to cover the first 6 months of the Commission's efforts. And so, therefore, we recommend that you reject the Governor's proposal for an extra $3 million. If the Commission finds that it would need extra money, it could come back during next year's budget and ask for the additional amount for 2011-12.
Thanks. Finance, anything?
Kia Cha, Department of Finance. The administration is proposing an augmentation for budget year because we believe it's going to cost more than $3 million to implement Proposition 11. We do understand that the State Auditor's Office has now indicated that they will be able to absorb all the remaining costs beyond the $500,000 that's already been allocated to its office. However, given the constraints of the budget cycle and the budget process, and that the Commission has such a short time to complete its work, the proposed augmentation would provide flexibility to ensure that there's no delays from unanticipated issues so that the Commission can meet its deliverables deadline.
Okay. The ever-generous and competent State Auditor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Elaine Howell, California State Auditor. As was indicated, my office has estimated that the total cost for my office to implement the portion of Proposition 11 that we were responsible for, which was a major portion of it, as we started last year in drafting the regulations to implement the selection and application and selection process for the Citizens Redistricting Commission. To bring you up to speed as far as the applications, we opened up the initial application period in December of last year, closed the initial applications in February, and then had what we called the supplemental application period where individuals had to answer essay questions and also solicit 3 letters of recommendation and submit those to my office. We're in the process of processing all of that. Right now we have close to 5,000 applications, supplemental applications that have been submitted. What we're doing now is we're matching them with the letters of recommendation to determine exactly how many individuals will move into the next phases. But the reason we were able to absorb the costs, I mean, it seems significant. A lot of those costs are internal, our staff. About $1.5 million is my own staff's time. I've had a lot of people that we've, in the executive office as well as my legal division, certainly has been putting a lot of time into this effort. And then the ability to absorb the remainder of the costs over and above the $500,000 that the legislature provided to my office is based on, I basically shut down recruiting for a year and didn't bring any staff in to replace individuals that we lost. So we made a determination. We knew the fiscal constraints the state was under. In discussions with Senator Ducheney, I knew that, there is a difficulty as far as impacts on the general fund. So I made a decision that we needed to shut down recruiting so that we could save funding to be able to carry out this mandate. It's a mandate that the voters gave to my office, and we felt it was our responsibility to carry that out as diligently as possible, like we do our other work. So we will be able to, we anticipate, be able to absorb the costs. The remainder of the costs for the rest of this year. Our job essentially will end at the end of this calendar year. We have to identify those 60 names as is indicated in the chart in the analysis by October 1st for legislative leadership. Those legislative leaders have the ability to exercise strikes much like a jury pool. Each leader can strike up to 6 names. There will be 3 pools, 20 Democrats, 20 Republicans, and 20 not affiliated with those 2 parties. Each leader can strike 2 names from each of the 3 pools. Those names the remaining names have to be sent back to my office by November 15th. And I have to select the first 8 commissioners using a random drawing by November 20th. And those 8 individuals will be 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and 2 not affiliated. Once that 8-member commission is established, they have to commence their work and identifying the remaining 6. The full commission has to be established by the end of this calendar year. They have to commence work immediately because they have to have the maps drawn for Senate, Assembly, Senate, and Board of Equalization districts by September 15th. So we're continuing on with the application process. We have reached out to the Secretary of State's office. We actually have a meeting next week to talk about transition because there is some responsibility that the Secretary of State picks up once the commission or as the commission is established later this year. So with that, I'll answer any questions you have about the work that my office has done or anything related to the costs that we've incurred.
No, it's just very sensitive, and I'm glad it's in your hands. I'm glad your vote on this proposition is secret, because I'm not sure if I was in your position, regardless of how I felt about redistricting. But I think we in the legislature also have to be sensitive, as does the administration, to uphold both the legal and spirit of the voters and make sure that we do what they asked us to do. So I appreciate your being concerned and being fiscally prudent and responsible, particularly around the issues of your legal department, because I'm sure that's daunting. But we also want to remain open to our role in making sure that you're able to do what the voters have prescribed for you.
Thank you.
So the idea is to leave it open. Comments from the Secretary of State, as Chris is telling me.
Yes, very briefly. I'm Janice Lumsden, Deputy Secretary of State for Operations. As the State Auditor mentioned, we will be meeting next week to go over specifics of transitional issues. While our agency has little experience with the redistricting and redistricting committee, we do have experience, several of our managers, in providing support for new departments and programs. Based on that experience, we identified, just on a preliminary basis, the need for accounting budgets, personnel, and of course IT and procurement services for the new committee. And based on this initial analysis, we came up with an annual cost of about $263,000, mostly for overtime for our staff, temp help, and to cover the basic cost of office equipment. While we would be thrilled to absorb some of these costs, the fact is we are having another permanent reduction of 10% to our personal services budget in the coming year, and we really cannot absorb the additional work. We provided this information on the initial cost estimate to Department of Finance, LAO, and the consultants. We would expect, based on we do not have a formal funding request yet, but we would expect to, after our discussions with the BSA, provide that request to the Department of Finance for processing. And we would also expect that the monies will be needed after the beginning of the new fiscal year.
Okay. I'll ditto to the other comments. So we will ask that you continue your discussions. We leave it open, and it'll be coming back to us. Public comment. Perhaps some of the proponents have something to say. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator DeSaulnier. I'm Trudy Schaefer, the Senior Director for Program for the League of Women Voters of California. And I do want to thank you and the committee for this opportunity to speak in support of adequate funding for the Citizens Redistricting Commission. And we believe that that funding must be available when the Commission needs it. Those are our two major points. We did submit a letter to you and also to the Assembly Budget Subcommittee, signed by AARP, California Common Cause, California Forward, the Center for Governmental Studies, the California branch of the NAACP, and the League of Women Voters of California. And it describes the kinds of expenses, what we call the needs, that we believe the Commission will incur as it performs the duties that are prescribed by Proposition 11. Based on that list of needs, we believe the Commission itself will need approximately $3 million to fulfill those duties. We've tried to be conservative but realistic in those estimates. So we are now speaking with a slightly different recommendation than what was in that letter, in light of the information that the Bureau of State Audits is not going to require an appropriation beyond the $500,000 that they've already received. Given that, we recognize that the augmentation that the governor's budget proposal makes is probably not going to be needed, probably not that entire $3 million. But we do not believe that the $2.5 million that's remaining in the current 09-10 year budget will be adequate, considering, as you've heard, the needs for the transition that the Secretary of State will need, and considering that our estimate is $3 million for what the Commission will need, starting with as it gets together in January of 11. We certainly endorse the staff recommendation that the Bureau of State Audits and the Secretary of State coordinate their estimates. We think that's a good idea and obviously needed so that what is planned for will be realistic. But even so, we're strongly recommending that there be an augmentation. We think it probably will need to be on the order of $1 million, yes, $1 million, not $1 billion. And we would hope that it be in the budget year. We don't think that when the Commission begins its work in January that it's going to be, we believe it's going to have to go right ahead and hire and sign contracts for personnel, for services, ranging from the various outreach kinds of contracts it'll need through the acquiring of the computers and software, a whole number of elements that are going to happen right away. You might note that much of what they do is of a very technical but also a very specialized nature. These are things that happen every 10 years, and around the country there are not that many sources of, for example, the Maptitude software or the people with the kind of expertise that they won't be an overabundant supply, and so that accentuates the need for the Commission to be able to sign contracts that will have to see them through their entire busiest time through the first 9 months of the year, going on into the 11-12 budget time. We don't think it's realistic to believe that they could wait until the 2011-12 budget is put together in order to have funding for those last few months of their work. And we also don't think it's realistic to think that when, as we believe is very likely to happen, they run out of money in 2010-11 if we go with the recommendation, that they could then turn to a deficiency notice kind of remedy for that. It just isn't going to be feasible for them to do it all in the kind of time that's going to be available to them. We do note that Prop 11 designed the $3 million that is already there as a floor, not a ceiling, and so we think that we shouldn't be limited to that. We feel, of course, it's very prudent to examine as carefully as possible every penny, but nevertheless, we all want to see this groundbreaking new Commission work right, and we believe that that's going to take an augmentation in the 2010-11 budget so that the Commission is not crippled just as it's beginning its work. And thank you for your attention.
Appreciate your comments. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Thanks for giving us the opportunity to present to you. My name is Malka Kopel. I'm from California Forward, and I want to briefly echo the comments of my colleague from the League of Women Voters of California. We've been working with a coalition of organizations and redistricting experts to monitor the Voters First Act, many of whom have had firsthand experience with previous redistrictings, with local redistricting commissions, and with redistricting commissions in other states. And now that the voters of California have declared that they want to participate more fully in the political process, we want to ensure that the Citizens Redistricting Commission has the resources to do its job right and in a way that adequately involves the public. We do think it's critically important that the Redistricting Commission be adequately funded. We also believe from our initial calculations that $2.5 million is not enough to leave in the fund for fiscal year 2010-11. We think that the Commission alone will need at least $3 million to do its work, and that's separate from what the Secretary of State will need, which means that the augmentation probably doesn't need to be an additional $3 million, but should be at least $1 million. And we do think that the Commission, because of its very tight mandated timeline, basically 9 months to do everything in 2011, less than that if you consider that the data doesn't show up until March of 2011, and the need to assign contracts up front, that it will need all its resources in the 2010-2011 fiscal year. And we do think that the assumption that the Commission can interrupt its work in the middle of that 9 or fewer months to go through a deficiency process is unrealistic. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for both of your organizations' hard work on this.
Thank you.
So I look forward to you coming back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we adjourn, any other public comment on any other item? Seeing no one come forward, thank you all for indulging me in the long hearing. We are adjourned. Have a good weekend.